Welcome to the Push Ventures podcast, Push Your Advantage, and thanks a lot for tuning in. This is our first installment of the Push Your Partner series of interviews. In our interview series, we are discussing various topics with different contributors to the African tech ecosystem, and our guest today is Michael Aldridge, founder of Kofisi. Michael read psychology at Cambridge before becoming a seasoned entrepreneur and angel investor. He has over a decade of experience investing and operating across Africa. He's very passionate about brand experience and service delivery and the impact that these have on people. Michael is British but lives here in Nairobi with his wife and 2 children. He's a keen runner and lover of all sport. Together, we'll speak about his entrepreneurial journey, valuations and key learnings from raising money, the importance of having the right investors on board with you, and finding your business model through learning from failure. Michael, since this is the Push Your Partner series, are you ready to be pushed?
I am. Thanks very much for having me there.
Thanks a lot for being here. So, talking about your entrepreneurial journey, Michael, being British, this is one of those questions that probably a lot of people ask you. Why Africa, and what is it that drove you here?
Yeah, I mean, we came out here, as you say, over a decade ago and found just the most exciting environment for an entrepreneur. I got a real sort of sense of opportunity, and immediately I got off the plane and came here. I talk a lot about this when I'm speaking at events, and I think the opportunity in Africa is very much the distance between the story and the ground. There's so much stereotype in commentary that for people who are not here, but when you actually get off the plane and you get inside the ecosystem, you realize there's so much more you recognize, and there was just so much more to do. I mean, there was huge investment that's being made in infrastructure and massive technology adoption, and I just realized that was going to create a very fertile environment for businesses to come here, and it was really trying to work out what the next bounce of the ball would be, and that was how it started for me, and I'm just really delighted and feel blessed to actually be part of the journey of all the countries that we're operating in.
Thanks a lot. And it's great that you mention essentially that the discrepancy between what you read in the newspaper before you come here and what you see when you're on the ground, because I can personally relate to that quite a lot as well. The first time I kind of set foot on African soil, and then you see what's actually happening and the developments. So it's a very good point, and thanks for pointing that out. Now, you've just mentioned it's been a decade. So how did you come to start Kofisi?
Well, I think like all good entrepreneurial journeys, we didn't start out with Kofisi. We started with a bunch of things, and quite a few of them didn't work for various reasons. I think you learn it's quite an expensive mistake as well, and it's a long learning curve. But there are things that you thought would naturally happen because that's the way they operate in other markets, and whether that was just the way individuals operate. I mean, there's a huge, when you consider sort of capital from the point of view of human capital, knowledge capital, and financial capital, there are huge barriers when it comes to some things that you take for granted in a developed environment like human capital, that you're just not ready for what's required to make that work, and there's a lot of dedication and time, huge cultural change that you've got to master. You in a developed environment, you think naturally towards financial capital as being your barrier, but I think that bringing knowledge capital and working with human capital is a big part of the story for developing ideas here. And so when we looked at the investments that were going on, what we did was we were looking for a business line that was simple and could cross borders, because although you've got more than 1 billion people in this continent, every country is different, and inside the country you've got splits, tribal, regional, districts, and it's difficult. So there's a lot of business models that won't work. But what we realized was that if you are a company coming into market and you take a taxi, stay at a hotel, the next natural step is a desk if you want to do anything more than just be here as a visitor. And so the idea of producing spaces that enterprise would want to come and work in developed market standards was actually our thesis for Kofisi, which is actually, Kofisi means cooperative office in Swahili. And that was the genesis of the idea. And we've gone through some iterations to get to where we are now, but it's been a brilliant journey of learning. And we'll talk more about what I think that means in terms of how one attracts capital and, good people into your business as well.
That's a very good point you're making about the different countries in Africa, because most people, when we talk Africa, in particular when it comes to investments, people always think of the continent as a whole and the possibility of the continent, and they underestimate the fact of several different countries really being very different also from the way you have to do business. So can you maybe just point out one or two things that you found in those different countries, which are very different, maybe just in an example?
Well, yeah, I think there are obvious things. You've got different currencies, you've got different regimes. You've got the mores, the histories of these countries, whether they're English-based, French-based, that's led to different kind of cultural amplification, right, from those early stages. I think that's possibly the biggest thing. Sometimes is the language barrier. Although most African countries, you'll find that English is well spoken. Business is done in English, apart from many of the French bias countries. Yeah, exactly. And there are certain services as well, like the disposable income in one country versus another might make a product work well in a neighboring country, but not in the one next door. In fact, there's lots of examples where countries just don't trade with each other, even though they touch each other literally on board by border. Kenya and Tanzania is a good example, right? And so I think all of that it's tricky waters to chart, actually, the opportunity in Africa. The opportunity is massive, and I think that's one of the areas that's difficult. I think the other big area is to sustain focus on one area, because it's in the early stages, there's so much you could be doing, and it's quite easy to be drawn towards another area, right? And I think just getting very focused, not just in your vertical, but in the specifics inside that vertical. And we've done that with Workspace because we focus very much on enterprise workspace. We're not trying to be all types of workspace at all price levels, and I think that's important as well. But you learn that, and when we're mobilised now we've operated in 7 countries across the continent, which is quite a lot actually. There are not many businesses that have been able to say that they can understand and operate, because there's all kinds of difficulties about setting up in different jurisdictions. But we're quite proud of that, actually, I think, in being able to say that that's one of the real USPs of our business.
And focus is a wonderful point. You just mentioned something about earlier that it was a long learning curve.
Yeah.
And quite an expensive one as well, like every entrepreneurial journey, with all the different mistakes that bring you to what is the now idea of Kofisi. You just mentioned as well the enterprise workspace.
Yeah.
Was there a particular moment in your journey where you felt like that's that spark that now puts you on that journey towards that enterprise workspace, which is now the modern Kofisi, the way we're sitting in it right now?
Well, yeah, there was an absolute moment actually where our original version, we were aiming to be a sort of integrated service company. That one of the things we did was Workspace, and I remember presenting to my major shareholders who'd come over on a delegation to see what we were doing, and we showed them a graph on a screen, and we're like, this one's not quite performed. This one's got a big pipeline, but we're not closing things fast enough. This one, we struggled to find some people. This one has gone really, really well. Then they went to the next one and we said, this one's kind of coming next. This one, la. And sort of when you look back at that screen now, you go like, you have one vertical that was just like rocketing. And then I remember just one of the investors just going, why don't you just do that? And we were like, okay, now, sometimes you can't see the wood for the trees because you've gone so deep into a plan that you sometimes you need that help from an investor who can offer a sounding board for you, and sometimes that's not them actually giving you. An investor said that to me last week. We're not here to give you advice, but we are here to listen and be a sounding board for you, right? But they're two very subtly different things. And actually the type of investors that you get, the one that has the opinion on everything is often the most difficult one, right? But, there's a lot of value add that comes from that as well. But that was the real defining moment for us. And we went, okay, let's simplify this down. And I think that's a big message for emerging market entrepreneurs, is just getting it simple.
We're going to speak about those investors a little bit later as well, a bit more. I'm very keen on hearing more of it.
Yes.
Particularly because of my background.
Yes.
But let's speak about the fact that, there is sometimes, especially being a foreigner in a country like Kenya, those initial starting problems where you're just needing like that help to get started. And if there was local heroes that you could point out today and really thank them for how they contributed and helped you to find your way, find your path, and come onto this track, which is today Kofisi, who would that be, and what was it that they really helped you with?
Yeah, we actually always sort of talk about our journey, and I sort of think if we were to ever write a story of our journey, our chapters would be headed by the people that we've met along the way, because almost the chapters of your experience were very dominated by a specific individual or relationship that you have, because this is very much a relationship environment. It's, as you know, you're never more than really 2 degrees of separation away from anyone in these environments in terms of what you're doing. I mean, and that's great, but it's also challenging because it puts a lot of mental stress on you, because everywhere you go, you're in business, because you're bumping into clients or potential investors or people you saw, at the weekend and in the evenings, in the restaurants. There's no anonymity, right? And that's quite hard, I think sometimes. But I had brilliant supporters. Well, I still do. I have very notable individuals who've really championed our cause. And I think, the thing for them was that their belief in our energy, right? That was the thing I thanked them for, was that they just celebrated the energy we had to want to take this on. I think probably in my own personal situation, sometimes it's confused people as to why there's a sort of a British guy who's worked in the city and could have done many other things has decided to come and do this. I mean, I think it kind of made people scratch their heads, and it probably talks to a later point, which you really need to have been here. You can't rush this. People are expecting you to go. They don't think you're going to have the mettle to hold out and do it. And I think those guys who just said, well done, I'm just tremendously impressed by your energy and your passion for what you want to achieve. Those are the guys that really have helped. But one thing I got told very early on, and I live by it now, was that, when you're here in Africa, you just need to remember you're a guest. I'm not African. My business is 120 people, and 117 of them, are from here, right? And so that's an awesome thing. But and I feel as though I would like to be here for as long as I can. But I am a guest in the environment, and I think that speaks to your personality as well. And I think if you're someone who is open-armed about learning and can evolve their idea by talking to people who've got expertise, and because these countries have gone through phases. There's been distinct phases over the last 5-6 decades. People have made money here in lots of different ways in each of the cycles, and I think some of those guys are just really excited that there's a new group that are coming through, and it's so dynamic now at the moment. I mean, as I said, I've only been here for 10 years, but just in terms of what I've seen, the change, and I think if you can, as we will continue on our trajectory, what this is going to be like in like 5 years from now is just so exciting. It just changes every day, and I find that much more rewarding. And I would never want to go back to the UK and be one of many, when here you can really be one of a group who are affecting the many, right? And be part of supporting change, because business here, it's very transparent what you're doing. You feel and see the earth. You know, it's very humbling. It's very humanized. It's so, this, you know, your attachment to your people, to your clients, it's just stronger, right? And I'm that, to me, is an amazing thing to be part of.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. I took away a lot of points from all that you mentioned on your journey. Maybe we'll get to the next point, which is valuations. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs who might listen to this or want to be entrepreneurs are very excited to hear your thoughts on that, because if you're thinking about valuations, it's always very difficult. You know, you initially start out with that dream. And as you mentioned as well, there is that energy about you as the entrepreneur and about the team, the initial team that make up that journey. So it's a very big question for a lot of people, is how do you actually go about setting a value onto your business as a price tag in those initial years? And how did you or your investors do it together?
Well, I mean, I was fortunate enough to have come from a banking background, as it were, like lightweight. I was corporate finance, so I had carried out valuation work, you know, as part of my apprenticeship, as it were, and I've really just applied a lot of the thinking that I'd learnt. And I mean, I think the thing that was exciting was I was actually doing it for something that I was actually now involved in. But, you know, valuation, it's an art, not a science in these early stages. And I think sometimes people are just a little bit too caught up on it. I think I think that breaks down into sort of a number of stages, because actually, you know, when you first start, everyone knows that whatever your valuation is not a real value. It's more a value that they're putting on you as an individual, right? And how much skin in the game do you have? And those two things correlate massively. So, you know, if you're going to start a business and there's a guy who's going to give you the money to do it, and you're fresh out of the traps and so first go at it, you know, your valuation is going to be set by the investor, and he's going to tell you what your percentage you're going to receive, and that's your valuation. But that wrestling that status quo at the beginning is really important. And, you know, I was advised by very successful entrepreneurs, like, you know, the deal you do at the beginning is the one that matters. Okay. But I think that can sometimes be confused by wanting to have overextended valuations. Because from an investor's point of view, you know, certainly how I think when I invest, you're playing a portfolio game yourself, and you're thinking, what kind of return multiple am I expecting to make from my line items? And I think you almost, like, my best piece of advice I could give on valuation is to try and think about it backwards. Think about like the journey that money is going to go on. And so if you are, you know, you reach the nirvana of the exit, you know, and as an entrepreneur, track record is coming up with the idea, establishing the business, raising the money, operating and exiting. That's the journey, right? And you don't get to say when you're going to exit, right? Someone comes along really, and the market's telling you when that's going to happen. But exit valuations is a different conversation. But I do think you want to think backwards, because if you actually can say, look, there is a business model here. And I used to see loads of these when I was doing corporate finance. As long as the business model doesn't say you need to be, you know, you're going to go into bottling and you need to be bottling 85% of all bottles to actually make this worth anything, then, you know, no one's ever going to buy that idea. So if you can articulate an exit proposition that is, you know, a very small amount of that market size, and that's where you focus the belief on, investors are smart enough to then work backwards from that number. And so if you think you can exit your business for 10 and that's believable, to say it's worth 1 now, simple math there, you know, well, we've got 10 times growth. So, you know, then they probably don't care if you've got 70% of it, because they just want to know that you're going to go, it's going to go somewhere. I think then when it's a blank piece of paper, that's a bit actually really an easier conversation than when you actually start to get some data that people can peg it to. That's actually the more hard evaluations, because then you get a lot of confusion between fundamental valuation and forward valuation and hope value. I mean, I always used to say I still do say to my investors that, you know, for me, structurally, the value today, it's important. It can be whatever it is. It's just for me. When I take this to the levels I believe I can get to, I would love to be taking a decent wedge of that, right? Because it's my sweat that's going to take it to there. And I think that then comes to your second point, which is that, the valuation, it can also be established by yourself. Because if you put money in, then taking dilution to that amount of money you've put in is actually the easiest way to establish a value in the early stages. But you need to be very careful not to overinflate it, because once you started at a point as well, and you're raising money along the way, you don't want to be in a position where you started too high and then it becomes impossible to sustain that hope value element of your valuation. So I think there's a lot of structures that individuals can think about that actually help them a bit with valuation, which I can tell you more about as we go through.
Perfect. Particularly when you look at your own journey, and you just pointed out, stretching valuations, what I really refer to a lot of times as overvaluations. Were there any mistakes where you felt yourself you could have done better, reflecting upon the years behind us?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think we got some things right. I would say that what I learned subsequently was, I think entrepreneurs get very caught up on ownership amounts, and that drives the valuation. So, I want to raise $1 million, but I want to own 70%, means therefore my value is X, right? 3 million, right? And I think there are cleverer ways to actually make the investor feel, because in the early stages, it's like, listen, this is my money, you're doing the job. At the end of the day, I'm the one with the real stuff. Yours is hope. So structuring it in ways that means that they feel that their returns are going to come either preferentially, or you're getting a return on as it's growing, right? Or, I've also heard of quite interesting structures where you just go for a non-dilutable, acceptable level. So you say, listen, you put the money in, and I have 20% of this company, and whatever happens, I'm going to stay at 20%. You're going to come in today, which means you actually own 80% of the business today, and that's the value. So the value is almost $1 to $1, right? And those are interesting mechanisms as well. But I know there's a lot more of that that's happened recently as well, with technology businesses of sort of these unicorns that have floated and so forth, that use clever option schemes to actually address those issues.
Agreed. I think option schemes and, rewarding yourself for execution is always a good way to incentivize yourself. And if you have the right investors on board, they can usually help you with that, and they're always very supportive of it as well.
The main thing you need to know about investors, though, is that they'll always tell you, they'll hammer you first on your business idea, then on the returns they're going to make. But as soon as they've invested, there's only one thing that matters to them: they get their money back. And actually, that talks to how you approach investors, how you approach valuation as well, because they don't need it to go 7x, 8x, 9x. They actually just want you to succeed. It's just a human nature way, especially with individuals. I mean, funds are slightly different because they go through different processes and their portfolio approaches. So they're looking for the sensible return, the 3 times multiple, because they know that the 7x is just, that's not where you want to be, because that can blow up as much as it can succeed.
That's a very good point. In particular, it comes with the word investor, right? Like we're always seeking for a return on investment, and that's how we contribute to the ecosystem as well. A tough question now. That's why I ask you if you're ready to be pushed. Have you ever had to raise a down round? And if so, how did it feel? Or any kind of round where the deal that new investors are getting might be a bit better compared to some existing backers. What is your thought on that, and particular with regards to all this overvaluation and hype that we've experienced over the past few years?
Yeah, I mean, I've had experience of down round, painful experience in one of the early businesses that I set up, where we had pretty punitive terms in our service contracts if that occurred. And, I learned the hard way that, if you overextend, then you're it's you that's going to end up losing more than anything. I've also been around in our current version. We've had scenarios where we've restructured, and that's led to a sort of not really a down round, but a dilutive position to the share price. And I think there you kind of learn who your investors are, because you've got different types of investor. You've got people who invest and then that's it, and you've got people who've got the liquidity to be able to follow on. And so some of the attitude of investors to those situations is not your fault. It's very much their own position, and you don't know what they may have happened to them in the time that they've invested. But typically, I mean, I've got some great stories of investors who have really taken the time to understand me, the management team, and the industry, and therefore the opportunity. And they can read through to the fundamentals, because the down round situation is about the fundamentals. Is it it's always somewhat the fault of the company. It's a very lonely position as a leader as well, because you've got to go and front that, and it's your fault. But I think if you see through that, then there's an opportunity in a down round, because you can average out, and that's where we had investors who did that, and then they've now made further returns. In fact, more return than if they than if we hadn't down rounds, right? But I mean, you have to be slightly philosophical about it as well. Being an entrepreneur, I said this the other day at a dinner. I was saying that I liken being an entrepreneur to climbing the side of a mountain, because if at any point when you're halfway up that mountain you decide to look over your shoulder, it gets quite scary. But what your job is to focus on just keep climbing to the top. And it's the same with investors. It's like, and I say this with the greatest respect, and I'm an investor, so I mean it when I say it. I put money into something because I did the due diligence. And if we make the returns for that investor, that we're not going to ask for some of those returns from them. They're going to make their money and they're going to go and do their thing, right? So the quid pro quo is that sometimes it might go down, some things might not work, right? And that's the point about investing. And it's not, we don't have a crystal ball for every event. No one could have predicted COVID, right? And so how do you square that up, right? That's a very material example, it's a major example of that kind of problem. So, it's a difficult place to be as an entrepreneur. But I think you've got to just, you got to get out there and you've got to just get on with it, right? And if you believe that your down round is just a function of something else, might be exogenous to what you're doing, it's your job to just to campaign that story and why you're having to do it, right? And investors will see the honesty in that, and so you just got to keep going.
I agree with that. You just have to keep pushing, I would almost say.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
One thing you said, the analogy, that was actually a very good analogy from my point of view. And I think, would you also maybe liken the right investors to being kind of the safety hooks, that when you actually look over your shoulder whilst climbing the mountain, and maybe you're falling down just a little bit, but they keep you attached, and you can get back your grip on the mountain and go climb again and reach that summit. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, I think that's well put.
Wonderful. I'm excited already to talk about the next point, but I have one more question about the valuations, and I think this is one of the most important points.
Yeah.
For all those would-be founders and founders out there who are listening to this, what is your advice that you can give, particularly when it comes to valuations and that long journey, like you just now said, approaching that mountain and aiming at climbing it?
I think it's to just make sure you've thought all the way through the structures. I mean, if you're not from a financial background, then find someone who can help you pro bono, or, I'm not necessarily suggesting you go and find advisors, because they don't always know the answer. Talk to other entrepreneurs. There are some really exciting and interesting structures that exist. And, I think the more you're out there, anyone can help. I mean, it's one of the most exciting things about being an entrepreneur is that sort of moment, that moment where you just can bump into someone, and you've got to keep the energy up, and you have got to talk to everybody, And so I think valuation is, you're as good as the work you put into it. You have to really pay attention to it and think through those structures, right? And don't be blasé about it. Thorough, and make sure that you've got solid grounding for your position. Because if you believe in it and you've got the cards, then it sells well, right? And that's what you're going to be doing in the early stages. I think as you get more proof of concept and you're really generating real numbers, I think you need to have that capacity in-house, either in your board or in your CFO. And quite often, maybe from an investor can help, right? Certain types of very engaged investors can help on valuation, but there is some science to it at that point, right? Because as I said earlier on, it's an art, not a science, but there is mathematical science to it. But the art of it is actually the finessing and thinking it through. It's a skill.
I believe that there is that balancing skill as well. That, as you mentioned, it's an art in the early days, but it becomes more of a science as your company matures as well.
Correct.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for this part on valuations. Now let's speak about the safety hooks.
Okay.
For investors.
Yes.
And we just now compared the right investors already to those safety hooks on your journey up the mountain. So why don't you emphasize a bit, what can the right investors do for you and yourself as an entrepreneur and for the business?
Well, I think first thing I would say is that there's actually three situations with raising money. There's not getting any, there's getting some money, and there's getting the right money. And that I learned the hard way, where I had my first business I was in was a retail supply business, and I had some investors who were from the real estate industry, and they just could not understand how the business worked. They'd written a check because they liked the sound of the products that we were making. But then we just spent so long explaining the business, and it became very, very stressful. Whereas I always try and make sure that my investors have got some affinity with, either the market I'm working in this case, in terms of the African background, or they've got some sense of the business model that I'm working in, because they can ask the right questions, and they can also, their natural discussions they're having with you, you're just learning, right? So I think I'm always so impressed and in awe of many of these investors that I have, because they've made huge success in their own capacities, and it's always just a real pleasure to be in the presence of another entrepreneur who's gone that whole way, especially when you're burning the midnight oil and you're doing the difficult stuff, which sometimes makes you question whether you should be doing it or not doing it, and why am I doing it? But I think when you spend time with guys who've been successful, and all the guys who've been successful have failed. Everyone has. In America, it's a stripe on your arm, isn't it? That if you've got a story of failure, British people are a little bit more cagey about that, But I'm very happy to talk about the things that have gone wrong for us. So I think investors love that, but I think that finding a good investor is a really important thing. But like I said earlier on, not someone who's going to invest and then you think, oh right, now they're going to tell me how to do it. That's not their job, and I think you've got the wrong team if you think that's what you're going to do. That's what your chairman does. That's what your board does. That's what your management team does. Right? Your investors just need to be relevant.
Got you there. So how do you define relevance? Like, what do you really focus on in investors when you're seeking them out? And what strategies did you use on your own journey to attract the right investors and partners?
Well, okay, the pitching man in me, and I've done, it's. I think the title of my book might be "Kissing Frogs." You're just trying to find the right frog for you that turns into the prince the principal investor, the prince, and I think that you are, I have a kind of rule I have a couple of rules. I know certain questions from the data, and this is probably the psychology side of my background, but I know that if people start to ask certain questions, that they're not the right investor. And some of those questions, and those will all be very specific to whatever market you're working in. And there's some very obvious ones for people who are investing in Africa. But if you realize that you're just part of a sort of fact-finding mission for them, and you're pitching and they're asking certain types of questions, you're like, these guys are never going to invest in us. And I think you've got to qualify out those situations, much harder than a lot of people do. Don't just go and meet anyone, know about them. And then I think the other thing is as well is that, when you're pitching yourself, if you're getting that sort of slight movement in their eyebrows and it's just so it feels as though you're telling them something that they just can't either understand, don't get, or concerns them, that you kind of think, hang on a minute, am I over dialing here? Am I mis-explaining, or have I actually got a major issue here that I've got to go away and resolve because I need a mitigating story for this problem? And it does pay when you're pitching to not sort of go, right, I've got my deck, let's just get it out to everyone, right? Let's just throw it around. Anyone knows someone? Don't do that. You want to go and see a couple of people and learn, because I have like a rule of three. If it happens 3 times, you change it. Like if you might think this slide is amazing, but every time I've pitched it, people are going, "Well, I just don't get this." That's it. It's not working, right? And you've just got to be mature enough to say, "I've got to change the way this is working," because they're just not buying it, right?
So again, reflections essentially on what is happening.
Yeah, and we actually, funny enough, I had a call last night with another company that's raising capital, and I think there was this sort of sense of frustration around the document, and I think that the documents, when you're raising money, is a big hot area. There's very different approaches to how you manage documents, but the document is so important, and you have to be, if it's a contact sport raising money, right? You're going to take punch. Things are going to get difficult, and you've got to be prepared to go back and retrain and go back out again, go back and retrain and go back out again, and that means changes. So. Saying to them, it might not be right. And if it's not right, we rewrite it. Yeah. And we get it right, because it's not by chance. It's like, there's a famous golfing quote. I think it was Gary Player who sort of said that, the more I practice, the luckier I get, and that's the truth, right? And
focus on reiteration and learning from doing.
Yeah. Yeah. I hope I got that quote right. I know I got the quote right, but I'm not sure if I got the person right.
I would have to check on that.
Yeah.
Maybe our listeners can just Google and double check and verify.
Correct. Yeah.
And they can post a comment to let us know.
Well, then I'll have learned to not use it again.
There we go. Learning by doing. Now, tell us a bit about how have the investors that are with you on this journey helped you in a few examples apart from the money? Because you also mentioned, maybe if you can combine it towards what we spoke about earlier, that, Africa or Kenya in particular as well, like a lot of nations here are very relationship driven still, because, you meet people everywhere. How have investors helped you?
Oh, massively. Verification, is a really important point. And I think sometimes investors don't realize how important that is to other people. For them to say, this is a great business, this guy is doing a great thing, is really, that's as much as you could want, really.
Like a stamp of approval.
Yeah, and obviously introductions to people that are in the sector or in the environment using your product, that's a great support, right?
Always happy to help.
Always happy to help, like using the podcasting rooms, or booking the spaces and championing. You're an ambassador for the business, and I think that's some of your obligation as an investor as well. So, there's room for cynicism as an investor, and I think you can bring that up in. Don't get me wrong. There are times when investors, they need to be able to have a voice. They should, they can act however they want to. Don't get, I'm supportive of that, but sometimes that can get in the way of, long-term success, because you might just be going through a slightly difficult point right now. And so don't take that cynicism on the street, right? Keep it inside the room. Have a frank conversation. And, I think investors sometimes I think a good investor makes it feel easy for you to spend time with them. Not sort of like, well, I'm waiting for your report, or you have to go and see them, and it's very ceremonial. It's more, I'm in town, let's have some dinner, or, what can I do? Is there anything I can do to help? I just because I think there's a combination of things as a CEO and a founder, is that I used this phrase earlier on. I mean, it's very lonely, right? And so you do slightly look to your investors to be peers with you in some ways, and you want them to sort of share some of the pain as much as the success. And so that's also great. And I've got, in the current business, we're really lucky because we've got a lot of investors that are like this, and I thank them dearly all, because they've just been so supportive of us on what's been a very long journey. I'm hoping now, for Kofisi, we're at a point where a lot of that faith is being rewarded, because things are, we're in a fabulous place at the moment. And so, but it's thanks to them that they stuck with us.
So I picked up like that professionalism, and also, being able to support in good and bad situations, right? And stand behind the business. One question that just came onto my mind when you mentioned that is, how do you, as an entrepreneur, look at investors who, invest in competing businesses? So someone who would offer you funds, but also invest in your competitor who's doing the same thing or a similar proposition. How would you look at them with the focus of, do you think it's still okay for them to do it in smaller markets in particular, like the ones we find ourselves in?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. If you're operating in a developed market, you're probably less concerned about something like that. I'm sure there's plenty of people who own Google and Apple stocks, and it's, I think that's going to happen naturally. I think in a smaller market, I think as long as it's not anything that's sort of obviously difficult about it, that you're providing information and then talking to your competitor. But there's no benefit. And I would go as far as saying, and I'm not being naive by saying, but I'm not sure I can think of any of my investors who have invested in other workspace brands in here. I've had people say, we can't invest in you because we're already invested in another one. But it doesn't pay for them to harm one of their investments by helping the other. So you're sort of naturally hedged, I suppose. If I knew before they invested, I would have a conversation about it, because I think that's an important part of transparency and trust, which is something we talked a lot about before. And because you're on the journey together, yeah, and so you'd hope that they would be doing right by you.
Precisely, and I think, as you mentioned, trust is an important part of the journey that you also establish with your investors as you go through the process of due diligence. One question that I think, again, for the benefit of all the listeners who are entrepreneurs or would-be entrepreneurs, if you had an advice, maybe in one or two sentences, that you could give them along their journeys to pick the right investors, kind of summing up a few things of what we just discussed, what would that advice be?
I think your journey for selecting investors is making sure, I think you've got to make sure you've got a really strong pipeline of conversations going on. Where I talked earlier on about having your documentation ready and being able to adapt, but when you go out to market, you've got to feel as though you can drive a large amount of potential through the conversations you're having, because you don't want to end up in a situation where you've got one or two and then you're just desperately hunting around for something and you're 6 months in and people start to get nervous because no one's interested. So people will confuse your business idea not being very good with the fact that you just weren't prepared, right? a good idea in the wrong hands is sometimes not as good as a bad idea in good hands for that reason.
So a little bit like be careful also who you mingle with.
Yeah, be careful who you mingle with, but be prepared. Just understand what you're getting yourself into. Both and look, another piece of advice I give to entrepreneurs as well is that, and I think most of them would know this, but this is a serious journey you're going on, and you're going to railroad a lot of your life to get there. Unfortunately, it's just the way it is, and so you need to give yourself maximum potential chance of winning. Okay, and that is the best laid plans of mice and men. It's absolutely about being ready, organized. Being organized and prepared is having the right backup, having the right organization behind you. And that's not a big team, but it's like how you're going to file things, how you're going to get information out to people, how you're going to track it, how you're going to monitor it. Take the time to think that through, like how you're going to spreadsheet that, or how you're going to use software to track it. How are you going to chase people up? What milestones are you going to set? All these things, it's a critical path. And if you're trying to do that as well as build your business, that bit is easy, when you haven't got going. The seed capital is sort of almost the easiest round you do because that's all you're doing, right? And you're just constantly telling the story. But, practicing and being prepared, right? You absolutely have to do that. So, you got to know what you're letting yourself in for.
Thank you. Let's move on to the last topic of the day. Discovering the right business model. And you mentioned already before, we have to learn by doing, and there is always failures, and how particularly, Americans actually take it as a stamp of approval as well, seasoned entrepreneur, and the British like to maybe sweep it underneath the rug and not talk about it. So when you're talking about failures, and you're thinking about them, what is maybe one of the failures you could share with us on your journey in Kofisi, and how did it shape you and your product of what it is today from the learning perspective?
There's different levels of things that go wrong. I think on one point you kind of have to understand is that you spend most of your time dealing with things that are not going wrong, are not going right, that are going wrong. You probably should be spending 30, and that can be called improving, right? But, I talk to my team internally about this, is that, we're in the service business. And so we're always going to have difficulties because that's what we do, to try and make it easy for everyone else. When it's easy, it's sort of non-memorable in that way. But I think I've definitely been shaped by certain experiences that, that I've gone through that have taught me to be prepared and ready, and actually being able to execute. As a salesman, which is what you are as an entrepreneur, it's often easy to get people to buy into it, but to execute it is really where the test is. And I remember I actually had a situation where I was, as I said, my previous business was in retail, and I took a major order from a client. And we had to deliver this by a certain date, and we just took on too much and we couldn't hit that date, and they pulled the order and I was left with stock, and that was, nearly terminal to the business, but we just believed we'd be okay and it would be all right. And there's a naivety to that. And I think knowing that you can actually deliver it is so important, because, it's those execution capacity. And specifically out here, I was dealing with American retail, out of China. So that was a pretty established channel. Whereas in some of the markets we are here, some of the things we're trying to do, they've not been done before. So I think for me, that lesson in execution was a very important one. Because you're constantly in a battle as an entrepreneur between your head and heart of that what you can do, and your heart wants you to you want to push, you're trying to drive for vision but deliver in reality, and that juxtaposition is really difficult to manage mentally and fiscally, right? So That is probably the thing for me as an entrepreneur. That's the sort of, but I think that fear and anxiety of that is the thing that people don't really, who've not set up their own business, don't really understand. Even if you run a big division, you've got big obligations. It's not the same, right? And I think as an entrepreneur, it's the thing that you wish you could not feel like, right? And I think that's probably what what retirement probably talks to, doesn't it, eventually?
So, those many ups and downs, and you've hinted at it a bit before, like with your environment, partly investors, but also the people behind you and so on. If you're just thinking about who helps you through those ups and downs, and, as you mentioned, that be prepared. So, the entrepreneurial journey is not an easy one, right? How would you really say, how do you make sure that you are prepared from maybe, a personal background and family in focus with the people that surround you on a daily basis, who are essentially like a support system as well for your mental well-being as you go on this journey?
I think getting them prepared or yourself prepared?
I think a bit of both, as in how did you approach it, or what do you feel is maybe important for people around you to understand and yourself to understand as well? Because obviously the entrepreneurial journey isn't easy, so sometimes it can also have a toll on those people who are like your partners, right? Your family, maybe even your parents. And we've seen, like, I know this historically in India, for example, it's been very frowned upon to start this journey. People were saying, go to university, get a job, and then work there and have the stable income, right? Yeah. Because your parents put a lot of money into your education. Yeah. So just when you're thinking about this fact now and looking at where we are today in Kenya, what are your thoughts kind of on this? As in, like, what would you tell an entrepreneur as they start out? What should they maybe tell their family and the people around them how this journey is going to be like? And, how should they also prepare themselves maybe in the mirror on a daily basis regarding this journey? Yeah,
look, I mean, it's a brilliant question, and many answers come to mind. I think probably the first thing I'd say to an entrepreneur is you just need to understand no one will ever understand. No one will ever understand what you're going through. But that's not the way to treat it. That's not, and I've made that mistake, and I must sort of say now, I wouldn't be able to be where I am now without the support of my loving wife, who's just been amazing. And I'm delighted that she's actually in this new iteration of what we're doing here in Kenya, that she's part of that journey. But she's an absolute support for me. But I didn't get that right from the start. I think you've got to manage it in a different way, which is you need to understand how to build it into your ritual, because it's all consuming, it never stops. And so you've got to find mechanisms to humanize yourself, because everyone else is getting on with their thing, right? Your thing feels very important to you, but understand what their circle of stress is, or circle of importance, and spend time as you can. And that will probably mean an additional set of sacrifices. I made a decision 3 or 4 years ago to stop drinking because I didn't want to spend time. I knew I needed to spend more time with my family, but my work was very important to me, and it still is, and it always will be. And I want to make Kofisi one of the great brands globally. But that's a huge commitment, but obviously my family matters to me. I don't get it right a lot of the time. I try my hardest, but I found that by stopping this, the sort of obvious side of socializing that came with the drinking side, and the freshness that I would have to be able to work, after events or early in the morning, that's how I got the extra hours, right? And so that to me was a big. I was like, what one thing can I change that's going to give me maximum impact? And that was my own personal decision. And, I've never looked back from that decision. It's awesome. And, I really advise it to people because, I just feel as though you can make clearer decisions and do a lot more. So your productivity goes up massively. So I think there's that part of it. I think you've got to understand what sacrifices you're going to make. But, look, these are easy things to say. And there's, being an entrepreneur is about getting experience of your own. You can listen, you can learn, you can, the path to hell is paved with good intention. It's, you can try everything you can and you can still get it wrong, and you will get it wrong, but just, it's okay. As long as you accept you got it wrong and you try and work out how to do it in a different way. And I think if you're open about how you're feeling and you've got a good narrative going with your loved ones, I think that's a very important part of it. I personally have a very good chairman. I have an excellent life coach who I spend a lot of time talking to, and I find that release as well is very advised, because you can get very wound up with it all, and no one understands, as I say, but no one will understand. But it's your job to help people to do their best, and therefore that you're going to succeed. This is in terms of inside your business, and your family will always be there for you.
Okay, that's a great one. The next question I have is a bit looking at you and asking you on your entrepreneurial journey. How much hair did you actually lose because of all those failures over the years and all those mistakes? And maybe take me to one of those points which I believe is critical and crucial and part of the entrepreneurial journey. One of those moments when you're this close to actually giving up, when you just feel like, so many things, like you mentioned, there's always so many problems you are kind of dealing with, so many things you have to fix, mistakes you have to find a way to improve upon them, right? Now, what was one of those moments when you felt like, maybe I'll just go back to the city? But how did you then also overcome it? And you just kind of decided, no, this is where I am and I'm going to do this.
Well, I don't like it when people say no. I think that's just been, a thing I've had all my life, and I've found that kind of negative energy is actually a real stimulation for me to prove them wrong. I was actually wondering whether you actually wrote this question directly for me because of the fact that I don't have much hair, but I figured it was probably more of a metaphor than anything. But no, I think for me, I reached a certain point with fundraising where I just thought, I don't understand why people don't get it now. This is ridiculous. And I realized then it was just because I was so close to the wheel, so close to the trees. Sorry, and I understood it, but I wasn't explaining it right. But at that point, I just can remember sitting there thinking, is this worth it? Why am I putting myself through this? And there were some long dark nights over that kind of that. It's very traumatic, actually, and typically that will probably correlate with some other moment in your life where everything over exaggerates and over dials towards this sort of negative part of the cycle. So I think being able to pull yourself out of that spiral is actually very important, and just belief, because when you walk into that room, people are feeding off your energy. So no matter how difficult it is, you've got to keep going. Just keep going, and you will find a way.
Thanks a lot, Michael. I'm going to attempt something very important now, I think, for all the listeners. And that's actually summarizing kind of the key talking points that we had. And I hope you chip in once I'm done and add something that you feel is important that I might have missed out, because we covered quite a lot of topics and also a lot of information to digest for everyone. But my attempt at summarizing our key talking points would be, I think on the first one, when we mentioned the entrepreneurial journey, one of the things I really took with me from our conversation was that you're kind of still like a grateful guest. You're very grateful for being here. And you see the huge opportunity, but people should always also be wary that it's 54 different nations, and you can't treat them all as just this is one continent and this is where the exact opportunity lies. but you need to be focused exactly on what you're doing and how you're doing it. Looking at the valuations, I think the takeaway would be that valuation is first an art, and particularly in the initial stages of raising, and then later becomes more of a science. But having skin in the game, it helps, and making sure that you're very focused in your execution as well is very beneficial, because it can help you even with options, schemes, and so on. And seeking advice when needed and from the right people, such as entrepreneurs or financiers and so on, and knowing the structures to raise money with is very critical here. When it comes to the right investors, you mentioned that, failure is part of it as well, and good investors can help you be a sounding board as well, looking at what you do and give you some feedback on that and help you reiterate and learn from whatever mistakes happen along the way. But you should also be prepared to, when you raise, to target the right investors, to make sure that you qualify them just as much as they aim at qualifying you in their due diligence process, so that you get to have them, the ones that you want on board, the safety hooks ones. Then our last talking point, the discovery, which is essentially the learning from mistakes part. I would say you mentioned that, making sacrifices and improving is very important. Knowing how you can, get more out of your daily routine as well, and accept also sometimes personal mistakes. And understanding that it's a bit of a lonely journey because no one really is in your own shoes, but at the same time, trying to understand the shoes of other people, right? And what they're going through, and working on yourself to always improve upon your business, but also your personal relationships, and making sure that you believe in yourself even when it gets really tough, because that moment will come at some point. I think it comes for all of us, and your own belief and your energy is crucial. And as you just now mentioned, just keep going. Anything from your point that you believe we should add to this, or does it sum that up quickly?
No, I think it's a brilliant summary. Ultimately, I think that the other key word is focus. That's the main thing. In all those areas that you've talked about, getting advice, valuation, and just understanding where you sit in the ecosystem. I think you've got to stay focused on what you're doing. Don't be distracted by anything else than your mission, and be clear about what that mission is, and enjoy it. It's really good fun. It can be crappy sometimes, but it's really good fun, and you're doing something brilliant. And for all those guys out there and girls, entrepreneurs that are listening, I understand what you're going through, and well done, and just keep going, right? Because it's awesome.
Yes, so keep pushing, right?
Keep pushing.
Thank you very much, Michael, for this interview today. Really appreciate you taking the time. And to all the listeners, I hope you really enjoyed this. You can find us on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook as Push Venture Capital, also the hashtag #PushYourAdvantage. And we'll be back next month with another installment of our podcast on the African tech ecosystem. And we're available on Spotify, Apple Music, AfriPods, and of course, YouTube. Once again, thank you very much for listening in. And thank you, Michael, for being here with me today.
Thanks, Ben.